Hey, welcome back to the Devin Townsend podcast. This time we're going to talk about City from Strapping Young Lad. Came out in 1997 and was the counterpart in many ways to the Ocean Machine record in which we discussed yesterday. So let's get down to it. This was another pivotal record for me, and one that was fraught with difficulty and chaos. So yeah, episode 2. All right, folks. So here I am again. The whole idea of doing podcasts at first seemed ludicrous, to be honest. But the more I do it, even though this is only the second day, the more I realize that there is maybe a value to sort of getting these things out of my system. For me personally, and perhaps as I've heard from a couple of people who have written that maybe there's a late night going on or you're on your own, whatever the case may be, I feel that perhaps in these times, just having a voice here may be of some help. And it helps me as well because it keeps my mind off of the chaos. There's a bunch of chaos going on in my personal life as well that is unfortunately something that I have no control over. Therefore, you have the choice of either continuing and trying to push through with something that's productive or focusing on it to the point where you're making yourself insane. And I think that's as good a place to start with talking about City from Strapping Young Lad as any place, really, the idea of making oneself crazy. So, let's take a step back here and think about how City plays into this whole lineage of albums. Yesterday we talked about Ocean Machine and how that process was rooted in a lot of trial and error and conflict. But it was hand in hand with this album, City, which came out in 1997 on Century Media Records. There's been talk as well about why I haven't done Punky Brewster or Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing prior to doing Ocean Machine and City. And if I'm being perfectly honest, those two records played more of a utilitarian role in my creative process. Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing was a conglomeration of a bunch of demos that was put out more so because it was the thing that I was able to provide for Century Media at that point. And I honestly didn't feel like there was a future in it. I felt it was an avenue for me to be able to release some of those heavier sides of the Noisescapes demos without necessarily having to dip into the Ocean Machine material, for which I felt had infinitely more potential. But as things go, you end up refining that process. And by the time I got to City, I had enough experiences with the Strapping Young Lad model, if you want to look at it that way, that when this album started to take shape, I knew exactly how to articulate it in a way that would be congruent with what was currently happening sonically and musically. And when it came to Punky Brewster, that was another example of an album that was, I was working at Century Media at that time. It was before Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing. And it was an idea that I had that, very similar to the Quarantine project, an opportunity presented itself to me to be creative for a week or two. And Punky Brewster took probably about 2.5 weeks worth of writing and recording. And it just was released as an oddity that fit in with the sort of nouveau punk scene that was happening back in that point. So I will discuss Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing and Punky Brewster in more depth in a future podcast. But for today, let's continue on with City, because between that and Ocean Machine, those were the two defining albums early on in my career that then set the stage for everything to follow. So during the creation of Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, I was initially propelled into doing that heavier material by two instances. One was the fact that I had been in a band called Caustic Thought as a kid with Byron Stroud and Jed Simon, who ended up being in Strapping Young Lad. And it was a heavier project than what I was doing with my Gray Skies band at the time. But I enjoyed it. It was my first sort of foray into listening to and participating in thrash metal as a player and as an active musician participant. And so when I was living in LA during the Steve Vai project, I went into the studio one weekend and recorded on a whim Home Nucleonics. And it was just an experiment. I had never really done that type of music before. And I just wanted to see how it would work. And I remember Byron Stroud came and stayed with me when I was living there during the Steve Vai project, and I showed him that demo. And I remember, because he was more well-versed with that style of music, him just kind of shaking his head and saying, wouldn't it be funny if you actually got a reputation for doing that type of music, being somebody who was just new to it? And I remember not even thinking about it, just thinking, well, it's just an oddity for me. I've got no intention of pursuing that. And the second thing that really catapulted me into that genre was a single concert that I went to see in Vancouver. So the Steve Vai tours were on a hiatus. It was between the first European tour we did and then the American tour we were about to do. And in Vancouver at the Commodore Ballroom, the show came, and it was Sepultura headlining, Clutch opening. No, Clutch was second, and Fear Factory opened the show. And this is when Fear Factory were on their Soul of a New Machine album. And I had heard it, and I remember there was a buzz around it because it was really sort of like death metal stylings and had that production quality that Colin Richardson was more or less famous for at that point. Yet it had introduced into that genre, for the first time as far as I was aware, an element of melodicism with Burton's vocals in the choruses of Scapegoat and all these songs. And I remember it was kind of a thing in my peer group. We all were passively, or even more so, interested in that Soul of a New Machine album. And then Fear is the Mind Killer came out, which was their EP that a local musician, Reese Fulber, had produced. And it was like an electronic remix of Fear Factory. And that collision of death metal guitar tones, melodic vocals with a certain amount of echo on them, as well as this kind of industrial techno sort of undertones that was popular a few years prior, and still to a certain extent with Nine Inch Nails and Ministry and all that. It was just fantastic. I remember it was really a genre-defying type of music, and I loved it. But it was also a type of love that was not galvanized by that point. I liked it. Let's just say I liked it more so than loved it at that point. But at that show, when I went and I saw that show, and I saw Fear Factory open, and it was an opening slot, so they had no stage space, and they had no props or anything. It was just them on stage. And it was so good. It was one of those shows that everything changed for me. And I remember because my whole social group was there, you know, Jed and Byron and my girlfriend and everybody was there. And I was ecstatic. I remember walking around to everybody at the show going, I want to do that, except I want to be, in a sense, what Wasp was to Motley Crue. I want my band to be what Wasp was. And Fear Factory would be the Motley Crue in this sort of example. I wanted it to be more venomous. I wanted it to be more chaotic. I wanted it to be more ugly and destructive. And it wasn't that I didn't think that what Fear Factory was doing was that. It's just that's what they were doing. I didn't want to do exactly what they were doing. I wanted to do my own version of a similar aesthetic. And I had never seen the band before, but I had met Dino. And in fact, as another side note, in Caustic Thought, the band I was with, Jed and Byron, we did a tour in maybe 1990 in a van. And we toured all the way down the West Coast to Los Angeles because we had some quote-unquote showcase at a show in Los Angeles that, as one would expect, 5 people were at. But on the way back up, our management had set us up with opening for White Zombie, and we did a bunch of shows in that front. But in order to get our finances in a place where we could literally afford the gas to do this, we stayed with a friend in Los Angeles. And it was all 5 of us sleeping on the floor of this guy's hotel or apartment, I guess. And, one of those tours, I was maybe 18 years old. And I remember while we were at this guy's apartment, I don't even remember his name, but him and his girlfriend lived there. He said, well, there's a band that just got signed to Roadrunner that have been putting out demos. They're from Los Angeles, and they are in the apartment on the first floor. And he said, here's their cassette. And it was Fear Factory. And I remember I didn't listen to the cassette, but I remember running into Dino in this apartment where they were just signed. I hadn't heard the material. And I went and spent time in his apartment. He showed me his amplifiers and he was telling me about his band. And it was one of those things. And then when I was doing the Steve Vai project, I did a performance at a showcase, a industry showcase in Los Angeles called the Foundations Forum. And it was the first show that I had played with the Vai band. And while I was on stage performing, I had a pair of Fear Factory track pants that I had gotten while I was on the trip to New York that Roadrunner Records had brought me to try and convince me to sign on with Strapping a Lad. And so when I saw Fear Factory in Vancouver, I kind of knew Dino because of those experiences. We were acquaintances more than friends, but we were at least aware of each other. But because Reese Fulber, being from Vancouver, I knew, and the reason, and I'll get into that in a bit, is because I had ended up playing guitar on his Frontline assembly project when Dino couldn't get across the border. So incestuous, this whole thing, that Reese said, hey, I'm going backstage to see the band. Would you like to come? And I said, absolutely. And I went backstage and I basically crawled up the band's ass. I was just like, that was fucking awesome. And I want to do that. I want that type of guitar sound. I want that type of blast beat, except with an almost more commercial structure. And I remember I was just bubbling away about it. I was like, this is my vision for it. If you guys are doing something that's like, from a color spectrum point of view, black and blue, which is kind of where they were at that point. All their artwork had blue and black in it. I said, I want my version of it to be black and red. I want strapping to be like this, but more chaotic, more spiky in a weird way. And Dino has always been very supportive. And over the years, I've ended up touring with Fear Factory and having extensive time with Dino and Bert and everybody involved with Fear Factory. And it's one of these situations that, you just evolve together, right? We've been in it as long as each other, and there you go. So those two elements are what ultimately brought out not only Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, but by the time I had put that record out and produced it myself and mixed the majority of it, I remember thinking that a lot of how I perceived the ability to get unconventional music into people's ears is simply to package it and make it sonically sound like it fits in with what is currently going on. I always thought of the analogy as being, if you wanted to sell somebody a veggie burger, you package it like it's a Big Mac. I think people in general are so tied into how a product is sold to them that if you try and present something in a way that people are familiar with, you can, in a sense, get away with a lot. And I remember thinking, okay, well, if I want to have this emotional content, which is bubbling up in me, of just apathy and destruction, and after the death of music with Ocean Machine, my whole intention was, okay, so if music and the industry is different than how I had perceived it, and how I had perceived it was so ephemeral, like a very celestial beauty to being able to present music to people. And it was almost like, because I felt in my own way that was taken away from me, that sense of the beauty of music was replaced by this awareness of the raw ugliness that is the music industry, I decided at that point that I wanted to use my talents to make something that was apocalyptic, almost in a reaction to that, almost to be sadistic towards that which I had perceived had hurt me, in a sense. And to do that, I remember after Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, thinking that didn't work. And it's not, in my mind, because of the content as much, although that needed to be refined. It needed to be more streamlined and interesting arrangement-wise, as opposed to just a bunch of demos, which is essentially what Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing ended up being. I needed to tighten that up, and then I wanted to present it like what is currently popular. The same sort of vibe, the same sort of sonic approach. And I remember thinking at the time, well, I'd like to get Colin Richardson. I'd like to get whoever is working with Fear Factory. And in fact, on Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, the person who helped me mix some of that was Greg Reilly, who ended up mixing Demanufacture and Obsolete and a bunch of Fear Factory records, but it didn't work. And I didn't realize at the time that it's much more about arrangement and production than hoping that you can just take a bunch of demos and then ultimately have them sound like something that it is not. So I looked into the idea of Colin Richardson, but it was too expensive. I couldn't afford it at that point. And during this period, while I was starting to ruminate on what the next Strapping Young Lad release would be, almost because I realized that by this point, I hadn't gotten Ocean Machine signed. I had my foot in the door to a certain extent with Century Media. So why not utilize the opportunity to do the second record as a way to be a little bit more serious about it, be a little less flippant. On Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, I was, here's a bunch of dumb songs, basically. Here's a couple songs I think are cool, but here's a bunch of demos. But this time I'm like, well, this may be an opportunity for me to get heard if I just put a little bit more into this. And to make money, I got hired on to a gig through Century Media Records, who was doing Strapping Young Lad, to produce an album by a band called Stuck Mojo in Atlanta, Georgia. I had met Rich Ward at the same Foundations Forum that I had met Dino, and we got along, and do to this day. I love Rich. And he was almost oddly, in my mind, appreciative of what the first Strapping Young Lad record was about. Because I remember always thinking it's a piss take. It's not what it needs to be. But I think he sort of saw in that what it would ultimately end up being. So he offered me the opportunity to come help him produce Pig Walk by Stuck Mojo. And he informed me that the guy he had flying out at the same time to engineer the record was the same guy who had engineered and mixed Destroy, Erase, Improve by Meshuggah. And that is Daniel Bergstrand. And I remember being floored by that because we were all in awe of that Meshuggah record, all of us. And again, strangely, that Foundations Forum thing was a big deal. The cassette that I got of Destroy, Erase, Improve, I also got at the Foundations Forum, 91, I think it was. So I went out to Atlanta and I produced with Daniel and Rich the Stuck Mojo album and got along really well with Daniel. And even though he had a hard go of it in that studio, I could tell that his connection to frequencies was just so much superior to anything that I was capable of at that point, that I thought, okay, although I can't afford to get Colin Richardson involved, maybe Daniel will do this. He's already in Los Angeles. I've written all this music, and I'll go back in time in a minute and tell more about that writing process, but I've written all that music. So at the end of the Stuck Mojo record, why don't I proactively try and book a studio in Los Angeles, which ended up being Steve Vai's studio, his home studio, and then it would cost me less to then just extend Daniel's trip in North America, have him come to Los Angeles, engineer the drums, bass, and guitar, and then mix it with him back in Sweden. And he was all in for it. It was great. We got along well, and that's what ended up happening. So let's go back in time and talk about the writing of Strapping, the City album. So after Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, I had done a handful of shows and one really sophomoric tour with that first incarnation of Strapping Young Lad. On that first one, it was Adrian White on drums, Mike Sudar on guitar, Jed Simon on guitar, and Ashley Scribner on bass. And we used for our backing tracks a super VHS machine that had 3 tracks. So we could use one for the click track, which was video, and then the other 2 for the backing tracks. It was as ghetto as one could be. And that tour was not necessarily a tour. We played a couple of crappy self-booked gigs that I tour managed and then promptly lost my wallet at a truck stop. And then Eula Garrett, who I ended up moving into his apartment to write City with, had to bail me out at that time because he was working at Century Media. But suffice to say, that first Strapping Young Lad incarnation was not really a band. It was more of an extension of those demos that I hoped to have perceived by the audience as being a band. So when it came time to write, I had gone through all these experiences while writing Ocean Machine, and during that time, I had moved to the UK, moved to a tiny little town right outside of Birmingham called Wednesbury. And for those of you who have been there, you know what Wednesbury is like. And for those of you who haven't, I highly recommend that you don't. Birmingham is a industrial, sort of not economically depressed, but it's a pretty drab, or at least back in 1992 or whatever it was a pretty drab part of the UK. And Wednesbury was just the appendix of that, essentially. It was just 300 brick council flats with 75 bars, 75 pubs. It was just depression and industrial working and just a real grim environment. And while I was there is when I took the call from Century Media to sign on for Strapping Young Lad for Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing. And whilst in Wednesbury, I wrote a bunch of the material there. And then when I was back in Vancouver after all this time and I had, sort of gone through that process of the chaos that was the fallout of the Steve Vai project and the disenchantment that was me trying to get Ocean Machine, which was my heart and soul, signed, it just hadn't worked. And then I moved to Wednesbury, joined this band that were infamous for drinking, basically, and fighting, and copious amounts of drug consumption. And I remember the whole time I was in Wednesbury, I didn't really partake in much of that at all. I mean, I got drunk a couple of times, but I didn't do any drugs. I hadn't done any of these sorts of things. And it wasn't until I returned back to Vancouver writing Ocean Machine that I started to experiment with drugs. And I remember that one of the pivotal moments, which I discussed on that last podcast for the Ocean Machine record, happened one night, all high on mushrooms, and just making a bunch of mistakes and ending up in this shitty part of the town and this whole thing. And from that night, not only did the song Bastard emerge, but also the song Detox. So as this career progresses and as I explain these albums further on this podcast, there's a reoccurring theme of the fact that one album coincides with the creation of another. And in the course of my career, I have often been dealt the criticism from reviews or news sites that my propensity for doing those two sort of diametrically opposed musical stylings at the same time was indicative of some sort of mental malfunction, rather than what I believe is the case, is that I could only do one thing for a certain amount of time before the fatigue just wears me down. And then because my emotional outlet has been so firmly rooted to musical output for me, I have to do the other in my own mind just to balance it out. So throughout the career, there'll be records like Deconstruction at the same time as Ghost, SYL at the same time as Accelerated Evolution, Alien at the same time as Synkestra, Ocean Machine at the same time as City, onward, 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 onward. And so during that period, I got back from the UK and I was living in an apartment with my girlfriend, whom we had been together for a long time. And after I had been in LA and I had moved to the UK and I'd been through all these experiences and she went to university, we were just at odds. It was not a comfortable relationship at that point. And I remember just sort of holding myself up in this back room of this apartment in Burnaby and writing both City and Ocean Machine at the same time. I had a little Roland GP100 that I had created a sound for that ended up being this quote-unquote signature sound for me that you can hear throughout my work, still to this day. And Detox and All Hail the New Flesh, all these songs, Underneath the Waves, Spirituality, they all started sort of evolving because I would write music for Ocean Machine and then get frustrated with that kind of mid-tempo vibe and then want to rage and then get sort of stressed out by the amount of energy that I was putting into that rage and then back off and do another Ocean Machine song. It was back and forth and back and forth. And at that time, my musical consumption, the bands that I was starting to really enjoy, were becoming more and more nihilistic. And lyrics became very important to me. And I think the most important lyrical contribution to my frame of mind at that particular point in my career and life were two things. One was Only Heaven by the Young Gods, which was much more poetic and a lot more imagery than like a direct sort of lateral lyrical slant. But the other one that directly influenced Strapping Young Lad was by the band Cop Shoot Cop, and specifically the album White Noise. There was something about the directness, the nihilism, and the sort of really acerbic, poetic nature of what that singer did that I just really was influenced by. And consequently, one of the songs that I decided to include on City was a cover of a Cop Shoot Cop song, and that was Room 429. The lyrics, Todd Ashley, it was just profoundly influential to me at that time. And I remember thinking and telling the guys in Strapping later, a couple years later when we were on tour, that if I had the opportunity to re-record and do my own version of the entirety of White Noise, I would gladly do it, because I found the lyrics to be just so dead on. They didn't mince any words. I loved them. At the same time, there was Morbid Angel, Domination. That album was a big deal for me at that time. Carcass. There was a bunch of things that were starting to become really influential. Grave, the album Soulless. And there was an album by another guy who I think was also involved with the Cop Shoot Cop scene. And the album was by an artist called Fetus. I think his name was Jim Thirlwell. And the album was called Mortgage. Oh, no, Gash. And in fact, what's interesting about that album is I didn't find the whole album to be engaging. Not that it was bad, but every now and then you may find that there's just one song that hits you in such a way that accurately defines an entire period of your creative identity. And the first song on Gash, called Mortgage, was it. That song, and I think the last song on White Noise, the song Mortgage from Gash, and the song Hung Again from White Noise by Cop Shoot Cop, were the two songs that I was just like, yes, that is how I feel. So I continued to write, and then I continued to be more and more dissatisfied with my relationship, and I started taking a lot more hallucinogenic drugs, a lot of marijuana, just things that I had never participated in before. And it was almost like my entire psyche, after coming back from not only the Steve Vai project, but the Wild Hearts experience, was just dark. I can't understand a better way to frame that particular period of my mind other than everything was dark. And I remember nights I was just paranoid, and I was constantly antagonistic and constantly looking to argue or fight or what have you. And what's really interesting about that is during Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, I feel that I was still the sort of goofball character that I was during the Steve Vai project. A lot of that was a product of naivety or, just not having the worldly experience. Maybe I had never participated in narcotics or anything like that. It was just, there was a goofiness to what I was doing prior to City that, although I felt like the same person by the time it got to City, because it had legitimately been involved with something that was ugly and dark, and it wasn't an assumption of what it would be to write music like that. It was legitimately, I was angry, and I was confused, and I was feeling the need to lash out. And so it's almost like, if you take that same character, say you've got Goofy from, the Disneyland character, just like, but then you make it legitimately rotten, then in a sense it's like more of an evil clown than it is something that is goofy. And that's what I felt started happening during the City sessions. Even when you look through the artwork, thank you, those who had posted the artwork on Twitter for me today. I haven't seen it in a long time. I wanted to sort of wrap my head around what it was, because oftentimes there's this sense that physical product is of no use anymore. Yet every record that I do, I put a ton of effort into the physical product, because that's a manifestation of the entire period that these records are meant to sort of summarize. I want it to aesthetically look a certain way so that when I open the booklet, I'm like, right, that's where I was. That's exactly what it was. And so when I see the booklet for City, there's still all these things like, grab your pick, grab your shovel, head on down to the Amish Rumble in big letters, and, all these, dumb sayings and my driver's license. And it's still goofy, but it was rooted in something that was a lot more toxic for City. So it hit a point back in Vancouver where I just had enough. And I don't think me and my girlfriend were ready to break up, but I needed to get out of there. I had been traveling. I had been going through these experiences. I'd been living abroad. I'd been doing all these things and just being stuck in Burnaby now again. Whereas during the period in which I had just come back from Steve Vai, it was more melancholy and more depressive. And that's what ended up being the catalyst for a lot of Ocean Machine material. Now I was just like, I want out of here. I don't care where I go. I just don't want to be here and I want to move. So I contacted Borovoy, who was the A&R guy at Century Media, who again is the current owner and operator of Blabbermouth. And I said to him, listen, man, I got to get out of here. I've got a bunch of music I'm trying to write and I'm going to go crazy if I stay in Vancouver. So he said, well, you can come stay with Eula and I in Marina Del Rey for a while. You can just, if you want, you can stay on the couch. We don't have a lot to offer you, but if you want to crash here for a while, you can. So I ended up going there for several months and then completing the writing of the Strapping Young Lad record on my own, City. So when it came time to rehearse, I remember going back to Vancouver and thinking, okay, well, I've got this band, with Jed and Ashley and Mike Sudar and Adrian. So I'll get together with them. But backing up a little bit, Reese Fulber, when I first met him, he was the guy who did the remixes for the Fear Factory album, and he was also the one of the two main dudes in a band called Frontline Assembly, an industrial band from Vancouver. And Dino was slated to come up and play on that Frontline Assembly album, but he couldn't get across the border. And so when I finally met Reese, back in time a while, it was because Dino, who was at the border, called up Reese and said, listen, I can't get across the border, but there's a guy in Vancouver that can probably do the gig for you. And Dino recommended me for the Frontline Assembly album. And I went off and we recorded Hardwired and Millennium. I played the guitar on those two Frontline Assembly albums. And then when Reese was about to go on tour with Bill, the other guy in Frontline Assembly, they asked me to play guitar. And at that point, I just didn't want to do it for a number of reasons. But just more than anything else, I had spent my time being a hired guitar player for people. And it was now time for me to really knuckle down for Ocean Machine and City. So I said, well, listen, I don't want to do it, but Jed and Adrian from my band are available because I'm in Los Angeles right now, or that's when they asked me to do it. So why don't you call them? So they got the gig. Jed and Adrian ended up doing Frontline Assembly. And then when I came back to Vancouver to rehearse the City album with Adrian, because typically how I work with musicians is I get the drummer, I write the music, I get with the drummer, I rehearse it all with the drummer, and then, if need be, I'll integrate other musicians. So I got back to Vancouver, and Adrian, I had set up a rehearsal at the Frontline Assembly rehearsal spot to go over this new Strapping Young Lad material with Adrian. Now, when we had done Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, Adrian was part of a local band called Process, and he was sort of a shit-hot drummer from around Vancouver, and still was when we did the Frontline thing, for sure. But at that point, he was so deeply invested in Frontline Assembly that when we got together for me to rehearse the City material with him, I really got a sense from him that he was not there. He wasn't interested in this in the same way that he was Frontline Assembly, which is fair enough. So I tend to really work off the enthusiasm of who I'm playing with. So if I'm with somebody who seems to be just putting in the hours or just interested enough in it to do it, but not put that passion into it, I would much prefer to go elsewhere. And that has very little to do with him or anybody in that situation as a musician, but more me. I'm like, listen, I know you can do a good job, but I'm looking for that enthusiasm. I'm looking for that passion. So I'm going to find somebody else. Fair enough. So I moved to LA and I started writing on Borovoy and Eula's couch. And I remember I had no money. I went down there without any idea of how I was going to sustain myself whatsoever. I had a black shirt that I had written in spray paint my name on for this, the first Strapping and Lad record. I just had a black shirt that said Dev. And then I tried to figure out how to sustain myself. And it was only about a week into it when all I had eaten for that 4 or 5 days while Eula and Bori were at work was white pasta with margarine. And Eula would come home at about midnight because he always worked late. And he would see that I was just like in that zone where I was apathetic and antagonistic and what have you. And he would often take pity on me because we were buddies and still are. And he would bring home a bottle of vodka and we would watch Mystery Science Theater and just get drunk and just, we loved it. That and Mr. Show. We would watch Mr. Show and Mystery Science Theater 3000, the early episodes, and just proceed to get shit-faced. And that was kind of, I would wait for him to get home. After writing all day, I would wait for Eula to get home and just get shit-faced every night. So he took pity on me after a while and he said, well, look, I'll lend you $50 and you can grab yourself some groceries. And I did. But again, that started to fade out after a while and I had no way of eating. So Borovoy one day said, well, look, you can get a job at Century Media Records. At that time, they had just put out an album. I think it was by the band Trouble. The album was called Plastic Green Mind, I think. And so Bori would hire me at Century Media to stuff these envelopes to send out to all these reviewers. They were CDs, of course, at the time. And then I would have enough money to exist. And so as a result of that, I tried to sort of stay out of their way and not make myself a nuisance and just write all day. And then the days I'd have to make some money, I'd go stuff envelopes. I'd come back and write. And I had my little Zoom box guitar and an ESP Explorer, and I would plug it into their stereo. And then the sound of this little Zoom distortion box would come through their TV speakers. And that's how I wrote. I had a cassette deck that I would document the ideas. And that was it. So I remember after about 2 months down there, there was a gig at, I forget the name. I think it's either the Palladium or the Palace. But it was a venue in Los Angeles or in Hollywood that starts with a P. I'm sure somebody will correct me on this. But it was Machine Head that was playing that night. And I forget who was opening. But Borovoy was a huge Machine Head fan. And so he said, well, do you want to go to the show? And I said, sure. Often what would happen, I remember as well, with Bori, I'd take him to parties and I'd become the designated driver. Like when I wasn't drinking, Bori would get hammered and then I just drive him home. And it was really, there was a lot of booze at that point. So we went to that Machine Head show and I remember making a fool of myself as well for a number of reasons. But at that point, I remember thinking, I don't really care if I make a fool of myself. I remember there was an old sort of veteran LA band there who I won't say the name of, but I remember the guy came up and he had sunglasses on inside and he was just the posturing that came along with this kind of C+ level rock star LA bullshit. And I remember at that point just being more than willing to call him out and did. And that was kind of my thing at that point. Now, I mean, I haven't been that way for years. I just think to myself, it's not worth it. I don't want to engage in that sort of wanton antagonism. But at that point, I was looking for it. And I remember being at that show and just getting more and more drunk. And then a mutual friend of mine and Gene Hoglan's came up to me and said, hey, do you know Gene Hoglan? And I said, well, I'm familiar with him because I know Individual Thought Patterns, the Death album, and they had been on Relativity at the same time that I was. And I was familiar enough with his drumming to know that he was a great drummer. And he said, well, he was a big fan of that first Strapping and Lad record. And I was like, wow, one of the 134 people that were. He said, well, regardless, he's here and he would like to say hello. And I was like, sure, that sounds great. So Gene came up, and at that time he was drinking a lot too. And we were both shit-faced. And Gene came up and he was like, hey, I really like that record. Actually, he was more like, hey, I really like the record. And I was like, that's great. In fact, I was more like, hey, that's great. Anyway, I'll stop doing that. I was like, that's great because I've got another one written and I want to start recording it in 2 weeks. Would you please play on it? And he was taken back by it. He was just like, okay. And that was it. And then we ended up hanging out a bit more, and that was it. He went his way. I went my way. I had his phone number. And the next morning, I woke up, and I was like, holy shit, that was a long night. I looked in my pocket, and I'm like, oh, there's Gene Hoglan's phone number. So I called him the next day. I said, hey, Gene, this is Devin. You remember me from last night? And he goes, oh, yeah. I said, you said you'd play on the new Strapping record, so I'm going to start booking the time. I hope that's cool. And he hadn't remembered that he had said yes. But he was just like, oh, okay, sure, let's do it. So there was the beginning of that recording. So moving ahead back in time, or forward in time, I suppose, I finished the Stuck Mojo record. Daniel and I flew to Los Angeles. At this point, I was still stinging in my own mind from the experience that I had had with Steve Vai. Now, keep in mind, the antagonism that I felt towards Steve Vai was very heavily rooted in my own trip. And Steve and I are now very close. We're writing again. He's one of the best people in my life. But at that time, I was so angry at him. Maybe I was projecting, but he had gone through a lot of things that at that time, I know in hindsight, he regretted. I was going through a lot of things that I know for myself that whether or not I regret, I recognize as being part of a dysfunction. But at that time, man, I was just looking for blood from anybody. And so when I was going back to Los Angeles to record and looking for a studio, I thought, well, fuck it. You know what would be great would be to take this acidic, destructive project and record it at the same studio that I had done Sex and Religion at the same studio where I had felt like I had suffered through what I perceived as a mortifying production experience. So I called Steve, and I think because at that point our relationship had become, there was an open line of communication, but it was still rooted in, I think he felt a certain amount of regret, and I felt an insane amount of hostility. So when I asked him if he would rent me the studio, he said yes, but I doubt it was because he wanted me there, and more so because we were kind of in our own ways trying to patch up that relationship. So I went, he had a studio engineer, and I went there, and we had about 4 days prior to the recording to put it together. And at that time, I remember thinking, in the same way that I was trying to put together the perception of the Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing era, Strapping a Lad, being a band, I want to do the same with this. However, I want this one to be badass. I want this one to be with people who, in a lot of ways, I looked up to. And I remember whilst I was in Caustic Thought, I had replaced Jed Simon in Caustic Thought, Byron Stroud's band. And they were really like a cool band. I remember being shocked that I was even in the band because they were like the cool band around town. And I was just, I was Dev. I was this goofy dude that played his guitar with a vibrator or whatever, And so the fact that Byron asked me to join the band, I remember being sort of in awe of the fact that I was able to participate in that stuff. They were always kind of like the alpha dogs of that scene back in Vancouver. So at this point, I felt like, well, I have something to offer now. This isn't me sort of trying to convince Jed and Byron to play my music. They weren't doing anything. I'd had the success to a certain extent with Steve Vai. Now I was in a position to be able to offer something, and they were fans of Gene's. So for those 4 days, I said, you know what, let's get Byron and Jed down to Los Angeles. We'll rehearse. I'll show them the stuff. Regardless of whether or not they track it, I just want that feeling of being in a room playing with these guys. So they came to Los Angeles, and it was one of those moments where we all looked at each other during that first rehearsal and remember thinking, oh, this is cool. This is really legitimately powerful. There's something about the energy of 4 very distinct personalities creating this sound that, although the music was written by me, although the aesthetics in my mind of this Japanese, dirty, manga-ish, nighttime city hellscape was very much my goal, they completed that puzzle that made the overarching vibe of that band like the goofiness of me, but flanked by 3 really legit dudes. And I think that's ultimately what made Strapping Young Lad as a live entity work, because I was always neurotic and anxiety-ridden and, just goofy. I'm Dev. I am who I am. To this day, I'm the same guy, only now I'm maybe older to the point where I can do those things without feeling the need to apologize for it. At that time, it was a little different. I was looking for that validation from the scene in a way. So it was almost like that thing that made Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing so goofy and maybe off-putting for the metal community at large was almost validated by the fact that it was Gene Hoglan and these 2 dudes, Jed and Byron, that were like really legitimately like badass players. And, it was an interesting scene to be involved with. So we got to Steve Vai's studio after those dates. And I remember the night before getting to the studio, we all went to a pub down in this industrial wasteland between LA and San Diego, to a bar that Gene knew, that his friend, I think her name was Big M, was working. And there was something about that night. We all proceeded to get fucked up. And looking out of this bar at just this industrial hellscape in Los Angeles, it was romantic to me because what it played into was not only that very vivid articulation of what I was trying to achieve with that version of Fear Factory that I was after, but it was also very much like what I perceived the environment that Godflesh's music was alluding to. And it was very much like these Akira movies and these sort of industrial Japanese futurescapes. It was just very romantic in a sense. And I knew that the night before we went into the studio, it was going to be an interesting experience. So the next morning, we got to Steve Vai's studio. Now, keep in mind, this is the same studio that we had done Sex and Religion, where I had gone through this transformative experience with Steve Vai producing music that, although brilliant, was thoroughly not what I wanted to be singing at that point. I wanted to be singing my own words. And although I'll say it till the end of time, that Steve Vai experience was something that I will be thankful for until the end of my days. It was incredibly difficult for me at that age. So being in this studio was almost, there was this sense of sadism that went into it. I was like, I'm going to tear this studio up. And I remember Steve didn't show up, and that didn't surprise me either. And we got there, and he had a studio engineer that was there that was going to oversee the proceedings. So Steve knew that we weren't destroying things. But I went in there with the 4 guys and drum tech, Steve Good, Daniel, a bunch of people. and we had no money to stay at a hotel. So I asked Steve, hey, is it cool if we crash at the studio? And I remember he said, okay, well, it's going to cost you X amount per night per person, which in hindsight was fair enough. But it was almost like I was looking for any excuse to be a dick. So I just ended up not paying that and just sleeping on the floor of the studio with everybody. We just brought sleeping bags and we just all crashed there. Now, to be fair, although I had that sadistic and antagonistic frame of mind towards Steve, towards the studio, towards Los Angeles, I also was still massively influenced by Steve and knew that the career that I had at that point would not have existed had not Steve given me that opportunity. So it was almost like a free-floating hostility that I was looking just to hang on any peg I could find. And Los Angeles and Steve and whatever else was a convenient one. What was also interesting about this going back to the Mothership Studios was the people that I had been involved with this time around were from a completely different part of Los Angeles. The first experience that I had had there was the more glam or hard rock version of Los Angeles. When we were doing the Tonight Show and we went to the Grammys and all these sorts of things, the people that we were involved with at that point were more with the Guns N' Roses side of things, Motley Crue's side of things, David Lee Roth type, those sorts of bands. And although, of course, I enjoyed that type of music, this time it was, Gene. His lineage was all Los Angeles as well, but it was a different thing. It was Dark Angel, it was Death, it was the more thrash and death metal side of that scene, and Dino and Fear Factory and those sorts of things. So it was almost like moving back with Borovoy and Eula to Wright City was almost about confronting that part of the Los Angeles experience that I either didn't understand or was furious at. So we recorded the tracks for this album in 4 days. Now that was all the drums, all the guitar, all the bass. Although Jed and Byron had learnt the songs, I was and remain to this day so fastidious about tracking these things the way that I want them to be that I end up recording a lot of it myself. Jed ended up tracking the guitars for Home Nucleonics. Byron played on a couple of songs, but I did the rest of it. And even if they had recorded it, I remember redoing it. It was just that important for me. This seemed like the opportunity not only for me to make my statement with Daniel Sonics and this group of people and these aesthetics and all these things that the pieces were starting to fall in line for, but it was also a way that I felt if I was able to get my foot in the door with Strapping Young Lad, potentially Ocean Machine and all these other ideas that I had could be heard on the backs of this. And this is something that I hadn't taken into consideration with Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing or Punky Brewster because I just thought it was a throwaway. I didn't realize that Censure Media could actually gain momentum as a label. You got to remember when we were first together as artist and label, they were so small. They had a couple of releases, but it was brand new, like a one-room office in Los Angeles. And I didn't, I guess, have faith in the label to take the steps that they eventually ended up taking, perhaps in the same way that they didn't have faith that Ocean Machine was something that they should continue to try and put their hands onto. So fair enough. So when we started recording it, we had these 4 days. Gene had to go through, he had never done blast beats at that point. I mean, he had, but I remember when we first got together, he was critical of it. He said, I don't like the sound of blast beats. And at that point, I was just fascinated by it. The band Crisian, Morbid Angel with Pete Sandoval. It was just, I loved the sound of blast beats. And that's why I had originally asked Adrian to be involved with Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, because he was the one guy around Vancouver that I felt not only could blast, but could blast with power. So I gave Gene, during those 4 days, all the demos for all the songs. The only one that wasn't included in that was Oh My Fucking God, which we ended up writing together. I had a riff, he had a drum beat, we put it together, it took 15 minutes, I then took it and turned it into whatever it ended up being on the record. But that collision between Gene and I is best personified by Oh My Fucking God. And when I gave him those other demos, he listened to it and he said, well, I would be more than happy, and I actually pride myself on learning drum parts exactly like the demos. Because in his words, guitar players often write drums that drummers don't think of intuitively. It's like a different part of the mind that describes what the rhythmic aspects of the song should be doing. So he felt pride in being able to learn what he would call impossible drum parts. And so he went out of his way, even with the blast beats, to learn all these songs. And at that time, even though it didn't come out till later, there was Far Beyond Metal, what's another one? Home Nucleonics, AAA, Underneath the Waves, Detox, All Hail the New Flesh, Velvet Kevorkian, which is actually taken from the Noisescapes demo. And on that demo, it was called Sun Mud. And so when we went into the studio, Gene played these things to the best of his ability, exactly like those demos. And it was a crazy experience because we only had 4 days and we couldn't get the right guitar sound. And we finally had to try and track down an amplifier, which I explained in the last podcast to be this Morin head that I think if I heard it now, it wouldn't appeal to me. But Daniel, because we were both in this kind of militaristic, kind of guerrilla style recording frame of mind, managed to eke a sound out of it that was very conducive to that sort of sound. So we tracked it, we didn't sleep, and I remember the best way to summarize that recording experience was at the very last day. We were all sitting around in the same room that I had sat around with Steve Vai and Terry Bozzio and T.M. Stevens. And now it was Jed, Gene, Byron, and me. And I remember farting. I just blew a fart. And it was very much, in hindsight, me. It's kind of in the middle somewhere. And then Jed immediately followed with a fart. And it sounds like Jed. It sounds like a coffee can full of hornets. Like somebody is zipping up a sleeping bag with utter ferocity. And then Byron immediately after farted. And it was bigger than mine. It was a little bit more low end. And then I remember the last one to let it go was Gene. And the best way to describe that fart, his drum tech at that time, whose name was Steve Good, described it perfectly. It's like 5 people farting and 2 people clapping. So at that point I said, well, there's the identity of this. So from there I took it back to Vancouver and I finished the record myself in my apartment. In fact, at that point we had moved out of the apartment and we had moved into this house that we shared with some other neighbors who were just atrocious to be in a house with. And I set up this little studio in the back room and I rented an ADAT machine and I got my synths and I had my little Roland GP100 and I tracked all the samples and the synths, at least I started to from there, until I met in a freak meeting this guy whom I had recorded with prior. His name was Raymond Donati. And he had a studio in Burnaby called Red Stripe. And Red Stripe was where I did a little bit of Heavy is a Really Heavy Thing, all of Punky Brewster, but then had sort of fallen away from him. And he said, well, listen, if you want to come back into the studio and almost take a residence there, you can pay me when you can, but it will give you the opportunity to kind of learn the ropes. And it was in the basement of this house that he owned. And it was a cool studio, but it was modestly equipped. It had a couple of microphones. It had a 24-channel Allen and Heath board, a couple of ADATs, and, a couple of effects units. But it had a lounge, it had a bathroom, it had a couch, and there was a guy that lived there named Matteo Caratazzolo who would kind of be there as a technical assistant if need be. So I then moved all these machines and all these synths that I had in my back room out, went into Red Stripe, and finished the album there. And Red Stripe, picture it if you will, it was a big, tall, sort of blue-gray house on the corner of an alley in a very suburban neighborhood of Burnaby, British Columbia. And the house had 3 levels. There was the top level, which was, I forget who was staying there. I know Matteo crashed there every now and then, but it was somebody else. And all I know is he smoked a lot of dope. He would just stay up there and smoke a lot of dope. In the second level, the main level of the house, there was a couple of employees from a local music store who were just, they were single, they were older than me, but again, they just smoked a bunch of dope and they played guitar. And then in the basement, and you had to go around the back, you had to come down the alley, go around the back of the garage, and there was like this little recessed entrance by a hedge, and then there was the entrance to this studio. And although, again, it was a modestly equipped studio, Raymond had gone out of his way to make it vibey, and I loved that. Like, the lighting was cool, the kitchen was funky, although the gear was functional. It wasn't that. It was that by being there, you were completely absorbed in this project. None of us had kids. Those of us who were in relationships were, they were relationships on a practical level, but it wasn't like any of us were married or committed. It was just this weird dude hangout. And so you'd go down there and it'd be this vibey place. Everybody's smoking dope. Everybody's drinking coffee all hours of the day. And I just moved in there, and literally I moved into Red Stripe and slept on the floor for years. I did all of Infinity there. I did Physicist there. I did City there. I did all sorts of things there. And it took me years. And then when they finally tore that house down, I remember thinking that was just the end of an era. Absolutely. So at Red Stripe with Matteo, I ended up finishing off the vocals. So I used a AKG or an AKG 414 into a DBX EQ and compressor into the ADATs. And then I remember the sampler I was using at that time, because there wasn't a whole lot left to be done. We took those tapes that we had done at Steve Vai's studio, and then I put them onto the ADATs there, and then we just had fun. And I remember Matteo, he would just be in the other room working on crazy techno, just high as fuck. And I'd be in the other room, and I would find out in my mind, because lyrically at this point, it was very important for me. City was very important for me to pinpoint to the best of my ability that particular period of my creative development with the same sort of slant, heavily influenced by what Cop Shoot Cop were doing with their lyrics. So I had a little Mac Pro, like one of those tiny little typewriter-looking Mac Pros, and I was writing my lyrics and constantly refining the credits and really trying to pinpoint what it was. And it would be the start of a trend that I continue to this day, where I would surround myself with the things that resonated with the energy I was trying to achieve with the record. I remember I had a black leather trench coat. I remember wanting my hair to be a certain way. I wanted it to be dirty and long and fucked up, and I only wanted to wear black, and if there was anything, it was going to be red. And I liked the idea. It was like a hornet, you know what I mean? I really liked the idea of just nailing that aesthetic. So Masanoda, who was the photographer who had done the Ocean Machine record, and Scully, who was the artist who had also done the Ocean Machine record, and Daniel, the photographer who had done the main images for Ocean Machine, I figured, why fix it if it isn't broken? And I hired them on to do City as well. It was kind of congruent. It was all happening at the same time. Chicken before the egg. It's hard to remember at this point what was what, but they were happening simultaneously, even though Ocean Machine took much longer to finally emerge. So while we were recording this, I decided that the lyrics being what they were, it was important for me to have vocal samples. That was one thing that I really took from that Fear Factory show, is they would have spoken word samples, as was the case with a lot of industrial music of the day, that would coincide with these songs. And so I had purchased myself a sampler, and the sampler was by a company called Ensoniq, and it was an ASR-10. And that sampler, although rack-mounted, I could then attach any number of controllers to, foot pedals or whatever. And it had a bunch of really grotty built-in effects, this sort of chorused, reverb, distortion presets that all I would have to do was drop them on top of a vocal sample, and it would just sound apocalyptic. So I would go to the library, and I would just look for video cassettes that were of the same general theme as any of these songs that I was working on. Underneath the Waves, AAA, there was a certain amount of sexual overtones with AAA. There was the idea of just apocalyptic destruction with Home Nucleonics. There was the idea of drugs and intoxication with Detox. There was the idea of just everything happening at the same time with Oh My Fucking God. Spirituality, the original name of that song was Spirituality Through Apocalypse. And there was also the bonus track, Centipede, a bunch of demos and things. So I would find these video cassettes, I would put it into the video cassette recorder, the same one that we used on tour with that first strapping tour. And then I would just run it through the ASR-10 presets, these distorted, chorused, reverb sounds. And I would just wait until there was a vocal that came through that seemed to, on some level, either with the cadence of the way the vocal sample played out, or with, it could be just an arbitrary sound, that seemed to, in some way, help illustrate the theme of one of these songs. And then I would just sample it, move on, sample it, move on. Then by the end of it, like the beginning of Oh My Fucking God, where it has that, a geographic event of cataclysmic dimensions. Things like that were just because I had found something at the library that shared a vague theme with one of these lyrical slants for one of these songs, and then I just applied it. And as is the case with a lot of my creative process, it's just randomness, the happy accidents that occur, to take a Bob Ross quote, is very much a part of how I feel I can keep excited during a very rigorous and often controlled recording situation. Controlled in that I want it a certain way. So, that's the basic overview of City. I think from here, in a similar way to what I had done with the Ocean Machine podcast, I'm going to go through City, song by song, and to the best of my memory, we'll try and recall what it was that this album was rooted in. And I think as I go through these albums, infinity is going to be a heck of a thing. But also, perhaps something like Terria is less in-depth. Although that the theme of each one of these records is overwhelmingly connected to an entire part of my life, sometimes there's not a massive story. But to be fair as well, I haven't thought about City in many years. So I spent a bit of time today just looking it up and listening to it and trying to recall where I was at. And what I think I've come out of this remembering is that where I was at was really a fairly pragmatic, creative point in my life. And that was just, I want to see everything burn. I want to use the ability that I have, flanked by a group of musicians who are legit in a scene that is typically known as being antagonistic to begin with, to use whatever talent I have to say, fuck you. And I think it's funny because when I look back at this, and specifically when people say, hey, Dev, as a 50-year-old man, why can you not do what you did when you were 25 years old with Strapping Young Lad? And the reason, other than the obvious, is City was an exorcism for me. And the function of my work is to progress even then, even if I was not aware of that as being a primary motivation for me. Its function was to progress. So by going through this, by exercising this, by saying in the most deliberate and direct way that I could, I hate this. Fuck you. I'm not going to tolerate this as my fate in a way. Once I'm through that, to attempt to do that again, not only is an insult, in my opinion, to the time that created that and to the work that went into actualizing that, but it's also impossible. It's impossible. So that being said, Velvet Kevorkian. All right, so what is Velvet Kevorkian about? Velvet Kevorkian is the name, first off, of the member of a band who was an offshoot of the Caustic Thought, the Kill, Grey Skies era in Vancouver, sort of metal. And that band was called Keychain Toker. And the guitar player's name was Russ. And everybody had pseudonyms. I remember Seeley, who was on tour with Strapping for years after that. He was the drummer, and his name was, for example, Stix Von Fons. And Russ's name was Velvet Kevorkian. That was his stage name. And I remember thinking, what a great name. It's like a slow-motion apocalypse, to quote the Grotus album title. So when it came time to start this album, I remember thinking that the thing that had really propelled, in my estimation, the Noisescapes demo into being something that grabbed people's attention, not only Relativity Records, but also Steve Vai when he heard it, was, in my estimation, the intro song, which at that time was called Sun Mud. And Sun Mud was just Velvet Kevorkian. It's the exact same song with maybe a different lyric and some different, tones, obviously, but it was really that structure. So I figured, okay, if this is my opportunity not only to make a step for myself into the music industry, but also potentially get my other material heard, why not try to regurgitate that trick, if you want to call it, that worked for the Noisescapes demo. So Velvet Kevorkian is essentially a proclamation when it comes to City, because City is supposed to be an organism, almost in opposition to what Ocean Machine was, where when you look at the face on the cover of the Ocean Machine album, there's a sense that an ocean machine is an analogy or a metaphor for a human body, where a large percentage of the human body is made up of water, and we are a conglomeration of the universe and star stuff and all this. The ocean machine analogy for what comprises a human entity, City was meant to represent from the opposite point of view. So the cover of City is a schematic that I found at a library. And that schematic is meant to be maybe the left brain, right brain between that and Ocean Machine, where you've got nature and water and the blue of Ocean Machine versus the cold and calculated schematic of a man-made organism that is a city. I remember while recording City and the whole aesthetic surrounding that record, as I said earlier, always is in line. I try to keep my world resonating with what it is that the next project in line seems to be suggesting to me. And one of the things, beside, the black and the red and the leather and the manga and the industrial death metal and the high-tech production and all that, another thing was this video game. And I don't play video games. But at that time, I strangely did for a while. And that video game was called Duke Nukem in 3D. And it started, the first scene of that video game is you're on a roof of a city at night. And so that was very much in line with that whole aesthetic as well. So Velvet Kevorkian starts as a proclamation of, I'm not going to take it anymore. Whatever it was, whether or not that it was even a legitimate thing. I remember writing all the lyrics that I was taking these little segments of vocal ideas from in a notebook, much like I had done and explained in the last podcast with Ocean Machine. But that notebook had a black cover. And I remember a lot of what I had been writing was just sort of free-form poetry, I guess. And a lot of that was just, I want to see things burn. I don't care. I remember, what was one of the lines? Fuck the hospital, take me to the red night sky. I think that's even in the layout somewhere. So these little clips of thoughts that were going into my journal ended up being part of it. And so when it got to All Hail the New Flesh, which is the second song, that was actually the chord structure in the pre-chorus. The all you are is all you are, I'm so sorry. That was taken from a piece of music that had been written with both Steve Vai and I during the Steve Vai tour. It never got recorded, but that chord change from that third fret to the open fret on the G string in open C tuning was taken from a piece of music that Steve Vai and I had done live. So in a sense, incorporating that into the song was also indicative of drawing my attention and maybe subconsciously drawing my attention to and bringing the focus of that antagonism back to the Steve Vai period. And All Hail the New Flesh because it suits me fine. All these things. And even the lyric, I'll see you pigs in hell, is taken from what I had assumed a lyric from Only Heaven from the Young Gods was saying. He's like, I say you pigs in hell. And I don't know if that's what he says, but that's what I thought he said. And that's what I wanted to think that he said. So I included that as another snippet in a grand scheme collage. And I prefer to look at all these records very much like a collage of pieces of a year that together make a summarization of a very distinct theme. And All Hail the New Flesh is simply that. It's I'm going to fuck this shit up. No fear, no compromise. I want it all. I will never be afraid. I'll die for what I believe. It was a proclamation. And what's interesting about it, it was that same lack of accountability that made City so pointed, because there was still an element of not humor to it, but just that sort of devil may care thing, that it was the perfect time in my creative identity for that to manifest. Because later on, that same thing with Alien, for example, became paranoia as opposed to strength for me, personally. But for City, I was still just on the cusp of having entered this new phase of nihilistic thinking to the point where I truly didn't feel like there were repercussions from anything that I said. You know, I felt like I could just rail on some dude at a club for being part of a band that I didn't like. And then, fuck it, just leave, and that's where I was at. Or I would get into a fight with somebody verbally and just leave without any sense of, oh, wow, I really shouldn't have said that. You know, I think there's a certain part of one's creative and artistic identity that, combined with the youthful enthusiasm that maybe an early 20-year-old has, not like you can get away with it, because I think everything has a cause and effect, but you can certainly rationalize it. And City was the time when I did. And All Hail the New Flesh was a proclamation of that, even unbeknownst to myself at that point. Oh my fucking God. This song was the first thing that Gene Hoglan and I ever wrote. And it was a collision of two chaotic personalities that intersected at a crossroad in our personal development that allowed us to be exactly on the same page. And it didn't take long for him and I to drift apart in terms of ideologies or children or any number of these things. And that doesn't mean that either of us is right or wrong. It's just that happens. I'm sure you've encountered that in your own relationships. And the love that I have for Gene Hoglan to this day is unwavering. I love him. I love you, Gene. But at that time, we were on the exact same page. He had come out of doing the Death Project. I'd come out of Vai. We were both angry. We were both capable. And oh my fucking God, was that collision. And that was a beautiful moment. Lyrically, Oh My Fucking God was taken from, in no small part, a magazine or a graphic novel that I was interested in at that time, which was illustrated by a graphic designer named Dave McKean, who had also incidentally done the Fear Factory covers, the Frontline Assembly covers, the Machine Head covers, and it was called Arkham Asylum. And it was based on the Batman story. And Dave McKean had done these really intensely disturbing and profoundly realistic cartoons of the Batman and Joker series. And lyrically, there were several lines in there that, if I look at City as being a collage of that period of my life, was very influential in terms of my thinking. And one of those lines was, "There is no insanity, rather a super sanity, more suited for life at the end of the 20th century." So that's the first line in Oh My Fucking God, taken verbatim from Arkham Asylum. Sorry. I remember when we toured for City, the first tour we ever did was called the Full of Hate Festival. And we were out in Europe with Obituary, Samael, a bunch of bands. And I had never toured that type of music extensively before, and it only took 2 shows for me to lose my voice. I never learned how to sing properly. But I will say that the vocals for City were the first real time that I was able to do heavy vocals with a type of convincing authority. I think I had hinted at that with Heavy as a Really Heavy Thing, but it was also still this sort of over-affected type of drama that I had learned how to do in the studio, as opposed to City, where it was really pointed. I remember doing the demos for Detox, AAA, Home Nucleonics, at a friend of mine's home studio in Los Angeles, Will Riley, who was the keyboard player for Steve Vai. I remember staying at his house also for a week when I was in Los Angeles and recording the demos at his studio. And in fact, the first time I really, really got high was with Will doing those demos. So when I went to track the vocals for Detox, the actual vocals, I remember thinking, okay, I've learned over the past couple of years how to sort of drop that act in the studio. It's taken me years and continues to take me a long time to remember consciously to drop that sort of affectation that oftentimes can be interpreted through a vocal performance, in my estimation, as something that is disingenuous. So when I went to do the actual vocals for Detox, I remember referencing those very rough demos I had done with Will to remember that it's like, listen, just be pointed about it. Don't over-articulate like a 1970s musical. Just really get to the point. And I remember thinking, I can't do death metal vocals. I can't do what Burton does. I can't do what David Vincent does. That's just not my style. So the sort of upper register screamy thing that I've ended up doing now for much of my career became a product of necessity rather than something that I was going for. I remember thinking, man, if I could do vocals like Entombed or Grave, man, I would do it in a heartbeat, but I just couldn't do it. I would just sound like Super Grover when I tried to do it. So the vocal style that I developed and sort of refined during City was one of necessity rather than choice. Home Nucleonics, another song. The idea, well, let's go back to Detox. Detox was about the same night that I had spent fucked up in Vancouver. The same one that I wrote Bastard based off of. Same night. How did I end here? How did I get here tonight? How did I reach this state? How did I lose my sight? I'm lost, I'm freaking, and everybody knows. Everyone's watching. So here's all my hopes and aspirations, nothing but puke. God, I'm so lonely. That was a very practical and literal description of that night. I remember trying to use a phone and I couldn't remember how to use a phone, and I ended up vomiting and then falling asleep in a pool of my own puke. And so that's where that lyric came from. Very practical, and there's not a whole lot of interpretation with that, with Detox. Home Nucleonics, I think the song title refers to, I'm going crazy at home. I'm going nuclear in my mind at home. And lyrically, it didn't really mean anything. I just kept thinking, if I made noises with enough echo, it sounded like how I felt when I was on the 10th floor at my apartment on Halifax Street in Burnaby. I'm just like, I'm going fucking crazy. And this is what that sounds like to me. AAA, the song, its title refers to the tuning. So the low 3 strings on my guitar, typically I'm in open C, or in the case of Detox, I was in open D. In fact, that's where Detox first came from as a working title. Detox. I was in open D. AAA, the low 3 strings on my guitar, I tuned to low A, and then 2 unison A's, an octave up. And it's this weird sort of chorused effect that that song ended up achieving. And then I ended up naming it AAA, not only because of those 3 A's, but also because the song referred to sex and how, as a young child, I had sexual experiences that were traumatic for me. So as opposed to triple X, it meant to be AAA. When you're young, the whole idea of Devi's in the corner of his teen years, born to run away, children in the middle with the village idiot, but he never made the potty grade. And I think a lot of even my scatological take on humor, even to this day, farts and shit and all this sort of stuff, it has a lot to do with a stunted sense of sexual identity from being a very young kid. And I think that working through that has been something that I have felt the need to do through music, And now more than ever, now that I have quantified that to a large degree within my personality and made peace with it, I think that clearly I'm not alone in these sorts of experiences. So having a more open dialogue about it makes sense. But at the time I was doing City, how that manifested was anger. Anger with sex. And I think that my lack of sexual experience back then too, I was so angry at sexuality that I just wouldn't participate in it. Even if there were women who were interested in being sexually active with me, I was more angry at the fact that they were interested in it than anything else. It was a type of sexual identity that took years for me not only to recognize, but also make peace with. And to be frank, it's still in that process. Underneath the Waves, the next song. So this song, ultimately the chorus, I was trying to achieve sort of that rhythmic staccato effect that I had been interested in when I heard the first song on Destroy, Erase, Improve. So lyrically, Underneath the Waves also refers to a very similar lyrical concept that Voices in the Fan referred to, that 3 a.m. referred to. The idea that what you had known, what you had been aware of, or had invested your reality scheme into believing was reality, ultimately when the cracks in that begin to show and you're able to start to see that there's a whole other plane of existence and depth, not only to say the music industry where on the surface it's one thing, but then you get into it and it's something else. When you get into one thing and then you get deep enough into it and you recognize that the facade in which it is sold as to us, as a culture, as a species even, is different than what it ultimately is at its core. And that fear of what is underneath the waves on the next record, on Infinity, ended up being a very single-minded pursuit where I was looking for, okay, well, what is truth? If this isn't the truth, if what we're looking at here is a facade, the idea was with City, how do you burn away the facade? How do you burn away all of this so what you're left with is naked? That's why on the cover of Infinity, I'm naked. But I guess that's something we'll talk about. We'll talk about when we get there. We'll talk about poor Mia who had to Photoshop my junk out of that photo. Sorry. Oh, God. Room 429, I think in homage to the lyrical capabilities of the lead singer in Cop Shoot Cop, I felt such a sense of indebtedness to him. For it was just like, thank you for just saying what you feel without covering it with anything, even when it's ugly. It's got a beauty to it. It's got a truth to it. There's no facade to that at all. And I think a lot of times the flowery nature, the affectation that I referred to earlier with vocal stylings and more pointedly lyrics that bothered me so much at that time is, as opposed to saying, I feel like shit. A lot of times lyricists tend to take this slant with lyrics where it's like, you know, the flowers of my soul are blah, 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 blah. And there's this lack of getting to the point about that I just felt like nauseous when I heard. And so Cop Shoot Cop, and the reason why I used 429 on this album was because I was just so thankful that I had been privy to an artist that was just like, this is how I feel. I feel like shit. And this is a way for me to say, I feel like shit, that is not so blunt that it is devoid of artistic merit, but it is the least amount of flowers to make a poetic statement about something that is heavily traumatic. And Room 429, if you listen to the lyrics on that, it just seemed to paint this image in my head of this, what you don't understand is where everything's leading. When all of the signs you see still point to overload. On the second, as you reach out your hand, a shattered picture receding, like taillights along that lonesome stretch of broken road. Just loved it. And you've been to the end, and it's just a reminder of all the friends who will never come to call. So good. So I put it on there because it summarized that period of time in a much more eloquent way than I ever could. And I felt like the lyrics that I had been writing for City, although fitting, were nowhere near as good as that. So it was my honor to be able to represent that song. And then Spirituality, the last song, that was basically a summarization of that whole period. It's almost like the mission statement, if this is all there is, won't someone tell me? Because I'm so sick of all these sick, stupid people. Not particularly eloquent, but that's exactly what I was trying to say. I was just like, I'm so sick of this. I'm so sick of this. Yeah, I gotta have a drink. Talking a lot. But why it's important for me to have this opportunity to discuss these records to the extent that I feel I'm able to do so with these podcasts now, fortunately, is it allows, in my opinion, the trajectory of why one record follows another to be more clear for the audience. I think that in hindsight, even by discussing this album, I'm able to very clearly recognize the subconscious need for me to burn it away so that I could be present with what is actually true. And that was infinity in my mind. However, years later, I found that that was also bullshit too. But perhaps the whole point of artistic pursuits are to realize that you're just entirely full of shit on some level. And maybe the only true art is meditation. Just not saying anything. And not only not saying anything, but being confident enough with your own motivation and not so full of shit that you would choose to believe that simply by being quiet, you're enlightened, but by truly being at peace. And brothers and sisters, I am not that. But I do feel that even during City, even during this early incarnation of this work, my objective has been the same since day one, and that is to further my own connection to what is true. And granted, that truth changes every year. As a human being, as an adult, your reality sphere changes and morphs each year. So you have to be open to the possibility that what was your truth at that moment may very well not be the next time. So maybe in opposition to what I was just saying about the true nature of what it means to be artistically satisfied in the long run, maybe just the whole idea of being an artist is just, it's akin to having a donkey with a stick attached to his collar, and on that stick is a carrot. And so the donkey is so blinded by the deliciousness of that carrot, that it will follow it until it is expired, until the donkey just falls down and dies. And to be honest, that's not that bad of a way to spend your life. Pursuing something beautiful in hopes that your intention of trying to help, and that even during City, even during Alien, even during any of these moments where it seems to be in opposition to these themes, the idea of wanting to help, it was the case. And City, I think, was, along with Ocean Machine, one of the most defining moments that I will ever have. I think I will end this by saying I had once heard, I forget who said it, a musician, probably wrote it on Blabbermouth, but he had suggested that maybe artists should only be allowed to make 4 records, and then they stop. Well, I think that that's not really an option for me. But I have to say, I thank you all for paying attention. And I hope you can continue to keep your spirits up during this quarantine. And the next record will be Infinity. Take it easy. Have a good night. Dev out.